All right, let's talk about the American Civil War. It wasn't just a war. It was really the moment that forged the nation we know today. It's probably the single most defining event in all of U.S. history. So, in this explainer, we're going to break down how it all went down and, just as importantly, what its legacy really is.
To really get a handle on just how big a deal this was, look at this quote from the historian James McPherson. He calls it the central event in America's history. So why? What makes it so central? Well, think of it this way. The American Revolution, that created the United States. But the Civil War, that's what decided what kind of country it was actually going to be.
So what was really on the line here? It all boiled down to two huge fundamental questions that the founders, well, they kind of kicked down the road. First, was the United States one single nation forever? Or was it more like a club where states could just pack up and leave whenever they felt like it? And the second question, maybe the biggest of all, could a nation that was literally founded on the idea that all men are created equal also be the largest slaveholding country on the planet? Those two things just couldn't exist together forever.
Okay, Section 1, a nation divided, looking at the causes of the conflict. So how on earth did it get to this point? Brothers fighting brothers. Well, to understand the war, you have to look at the deep cracks that had been forming in the foundation of the country for decades. This wasn't something that happened overnight. It was more like a slow, agonizing tear.
When you look at the causes, you see all these different issues, right? States' rights versus the federal government, fights over new territories, different economies. But really, they all orbited around one massive central issue: slavery. When people argued about states' rights, what they were really arguing about was the right of states to protect the institution of slavery. The fight over new land, it was about whether that land would be free or slave. You ended up with two completely different worlds, an industrial North and a Southern economy that was completely 100% built on the backs of enslaved people. There was just no compromise to be found.
So what was the spark that lit the fuse? Well, it was the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency, and his whole platform was about stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. For the South, that was the last straw. They saw it as an existential threat. So, one by one, 7 states just left. They formed their own country, the Confederate States of America. Of course, the Union said, "No way, you can't just leave." And this whole standoff finally came to a head at a little federal fort in Charleston Harbor called Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire. And that was it. The time for talking was over. The war had begun.
All right, Section 2, the first modern war. We're going to look at the technology and the strategy. Because the war that erupted was different. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. People call it the first modern war, and for good reason. You had this brutal collision of brand new deadly technology with old school tactics, and the result? It was absolutely devastating. It changed warfare forever.
So, the North had this big overarching strategy, and it had a pretty memorable name, the Anaconda Plan. And the name tells you everything you need to know. The idea, cooked up by General Winfield Scott, was to literally squeeze the life out of the Confederacy, just like an anaconda. Step 1, a massive naval blockade of all the southern ports to cut off their supplies and trade. Step 2, seize control of the entire Mississippi River. If you do that, you've basically sliced the Confederacy right in half. It was a plan to win not just by fighting, but by slowly strangling them economically and geographically. And on the battlefield itself, new technology made the killing horrifyingly efficient. For instance, you had rifled muskets. This meant soldiers could now accurately shoot from hundreds of yards away, way further than before. Suddenly, those old-fashioned infantry charges across an open field, they became absolute suicide missions. And then, behind the lines, you had the railroad and the telegraph. These were the real game changers. They created a revolution in logistics, letting armies move troops and supplies and communicate with each other at speeds that were just completely unimaginable just a few years before.
Let's zoom in on the railroads for a second, because they were truly a weapon of war. The North, with its massive industrial rail network, had a huge advantage here. They could move thousands of soldiers to a critical spot almost overnight. They could keep those armies supplied for months on end. And then they got creative. They started putting armor on trains and even giant cannons and mortars on railcars. There was this famous one called the Dictator at the Siege of Petersburg. They turned the railroad into mobile artillery. It was an absolute game changer. And this quote from U.S. Grant III, the general's grandson, really sums it up. He said the leaders were working with new arms in new media, and that it was remarkable they did so well. What he's getting at is that these generals weren't just fighting an enemy army. They were fighting a whole new kind of war.
They were trying to figure out these new technologies in real time, adapting on the fly. And the tuition for that battlefield education? It was paid for with hundreds of thousands of lives.
Section 3. A New Birth of Freedom, all about the war's evolving purpose. Because this war wasn't just about new cannons and tactics. Something much deeper started to happen. The very soul of the war began to change. What started out as a fight to simply hold the old country together, it transformed into a revolutionary struggle to build a brand new and freer nation.
This is the pivotal moment. The goal of the war itself actually shifted. You see, as the fighting dragged on and the casualties mounted, the Union leadership had a stunning realization. They understood that to actually win this thing, and to make sure a war like this never happened again, they couldn't just beat the Confederate armies on the field. They had to go after the root cause. They had to destroy the very institution that the entire Southern way of life was built on, slavery. This is what Lincoln would later call a new birth of freedom.
And the main tool for this change? The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Now here's the part that a lot of people miss. It was a work of legal genius. Lincoln didn't just issue it as a purely moral statement. He framed it, very cleverly, as a military necessity. You see, as commander-in-chief, he had the power under the laws of war to seize enemy property being used to help their war effort. So by officially classifying enslaved people in the South as a resource that was helping the Confederacy fight, he gave himself the legal power to set them free. It was a brilliant strategic move.
And what was the practical effect of this? Well, just look at this number, 180,000. That's how many black men, many of whom had literally escaped slavery themselves, joined the Union Army. Think about that. They put on the uniform of the country that had enslaved them, and they picked up guns to fight for its preservation and to destroy slavery once and for all.
But their fight wasn't just against the rebels in gray. They were fighting a second war, a war for their own dignity. And this heartbreaking question from Corporal James Henry Gooding says it all. We have done a soldier's duty. Why can't we have a soldier's pay? Because believe it or not, at first they were paid less than white soldiers. They were often given worse equipment. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Confederacy and another against the prejudice within their own army.
And their impact was absolutely enormous. By the end of the war, these soldiers made up almost 10% of the entire Union Army. Their contribution was critical. You had units like the famous 54th Massachusetts, whose incredible bravery at the assault on Fort Wagner proved their mettle beyond any doubt. And that courage on the battlefield, it gave them the moral high ground in their fight for equality. They protested the unequal pay, and guess what? In 1864, they won. Their service was a double victory. It helped save the Union, and it staked an undeniable claim to their own citizenship and rights.
And you know, the war didn't just change things for soldiers. It completely turned society on its head back home, especially for women. I mean, with millions of men off at the front, women had to step up and do everything. They were running the farms, the plantations, the family businesses. They flooded into factories to make bullets and uniforms. They became politically active, forming groups like the Women's National Loyal League to push for the abolition of slavery. And some even became spies, using the fact that nobody suspected them to gather incredibly valuable intelligence.
One of the most incredible areas where women had a huge impact was in medicine. They literally revolutionized military medical care. First, they organized. Groups like the U.S. Sanitary Commission, mostly run by women, raised huge amounts of money and pushed for better sanitation in army camps, saving countless lives from disease. Then they professionalized the work. A woman named Dorothea Dix was made the superintendent of Army nurses, creating an official, professional path for women in medicine. And finally, they humanized it. People like Clara Barton, who worked right on the front lines helping the wounded, went on to found the American Red Cross. So you see, they didn't just help out. They built the foundations of modern nursing.
Okay, Section 4. And this is a really important part of the story that often gets overlooked. It's the war after the war, a violent reconstruction. You know, we all have that image in our heads, right? General Lee surrendering at Appomattox in 1865, and the war is over. But that's not really the full picture. What came next was a brutal 12-year-long fight for the soul of the South. You can think of it as a second, undeclared civil war.
Just look at the contrast here. You have the official peace treaty in April 1865, but then you have this continued conflict that lasts all the way to 1877. It was basically a Southern Civil War. On one side, you had these brand new democratic state governments, with both black and white officials elected to office for the first time. And on the other side, you had an insurgency of white supremacist groups full of ex-Confederate soldiers who were willing to use any amount of violence to overthrow those governments and put a system of racial hierarchy back in place.
And this second war got worse over time.
It started as just raw terror, massacres of freed people and their white allies. Then it got more organized. It became a full-blown guerrilla war, with groups like the Ku Klux Klan leading an insurgency against the elected governments. And in the final phase, it was basically open warfare, with paramilitary armies openly battling state militias in the streets. And how did it all end? With a backroom political deal in 1877. The federal government agreed to pull its troops out of the South, and with that, Reconstruction was over. The federal government essentially walked away, and the white supremacist forces won.
So that brings us to our final section, a redefined America, and the war's enduring legacy. When you take all of this together, the war itself and that violent, chaotic period that followed, what are we left with? Well, it's a legacy that is, at the same time, absolutely monumental and also deeply, deeply troubled.
First, let's just talk about the human cost. This number, 625,000. That's the low-end estimate of how many soldiers died. To really put that into perspective for you, that is almost as many American soldiers who have died in all other U.S. wars combined, from the Revolution right up to today. It was a level of death and destruction that just scarred the nation for generations. But with all that sacrifice, what was actually achieved? Well, those two huge questions from the beginning, they were finally answered, once and for all. First, the idea that a state could just leave the Union was settled. It was dead. The United States was a single, indivisible nation. And second, and most importantly, the institution of slavery, the thing that had haunted the country since its birth, was finally destroyed, wiped out. But I want to leave you with this final thought. The Civil War answered the question of what the United States is. It's one nation, indivisible. But the way Reconstruction ended so violently, it left a different question wide open. The question of who that nation is really for. The struggles over equality and justice from that time, well, they cast a very long shadow. And you can still hear the echoes of those battles in the American story right up to this very day.